I was asked to speak on topics in artificial intelligence and technology and mathematics and the sciences from a biblical perspective and keeping it in the theme of the event, which is God's sovereignty. So there's a lot of things that one could say in the intersection of those ideas, and I have 45 minutes. So I'm going to try my best. And the way I thought that I would approach this is just to kind of give you some personal reflections as I've worked in this field. And I think one way that's helpful to do that is to think of the next slide, which says, oh, thank you. Oh, turn it on. Okay. Okay, so speaking of technology, I want to think of God's sovereignty by reflecting on some ideas in artificial intelligence and the sciences as they've happened in the past, in the present, and in the future. So I'm just going to kind of meander. We're going to take a leisurely walk through some ideas. And again, there's a lot of things that you might want to hear, that you might have questions of, and I may not address them, but I'll show you some resources at the end. Okay, so this is the game plan. Now, before we start, point one, the past, I want to introduce for you an idea that's going to be the conceptual foundation for the rest of this talk, all right? So I want to say something about artificial intelligence, which is, broadly speaking, involves the creation of computer systems that can perform certain tasks at the level of humans or better, broadly speaking. Now, computers are very good at numbers. So I want to say something about numbers for a second, and then I'm going to return to this outline, okay? So here's a perfectly good example of a number. It's the number 3. There's nothing wrong with it. But numbers become useful when they represent something that people care about. So for example, I could tell you I have 3 cats. I mean, I don't have 3 cats, but I could say if one had 3 cats, that might be interesting to you for some reason. But it's also advantageous to sometimes think of 2 numbers at the same time. So for example, I might want to think of the numbers 10 and 27, and I'm going to put these little square brackets around them because I want to think of them as like buddies. Together they represent some information. Like what? One example could be, maybe I'm going to visit someone and I travel 10 miles east and 27 miles north. So that's a way that 2 numbers could be interesting together. By the way, mathematicians would say that this pair of numbers is 2-dimensional, lives in some 2-dimensional space. One dimension you can think of as like the east and west direction, and one is the north and south direction. Okay, so numbers, when they represent something, are useful. Well, we live in 3-dimensional space, so I could think of triples of numbers. Here's an example. Maybe I work at a hospital, say, and I have some patient data, and maybe I'm interested in a patient's age, weight, and height, for example. You can figure out the units so that this makes sense. But 3 dimensions. Okay, this is an example of a 3-dimensional string of numbers. Now, there is nothing stopping me from adding a 4th number to this list. So I then have a 4-dimensional piece of information. But what's stopping me from adding a 5th number to that list? Nothing. So even though we live in 3-dimensional space, there's nothing stopping mathematicians from thinking in higher dimensions. So here is an example of a 100-dimensional string of numbers. And you may say, oh, you're just doing that, because you have nothing else to do on a Friday night. But actually, these numbers could represent something interesting and relevant, like the pixel values in a grayscale image. So if I have a grayscale image, my pixel values are shades of gray, and those are captured by numbers between 0 and 255, where 0 represents black and 255 is white, and everything in between is some shade of gray. So you see, and so this is like a 10 by 10 pixel grid. So I have 100 numbers, so I've listed them out. So you may think, wow, 100 dimensions, that's like science fiction. No, it's not, it's an image. All right, why am I telling you all of this? For 2 reasons. Number 1, we call lists of numbers associated to things people care about. One of the names is Cartesian coordinates. These are Cartesian coordinates associated to an image, associated to patient's information, associated to distance travel to go visit a friend. Cartesian coordinates. That's what the list of numbers is called. I'm telling you that because it's going to come back later. So remember that. The other reason I went through all of this is to let you know that much of machine learning relies on finding useful coordinates to represent things in the world. So, for example, you know, I'm sure, that computers are good at good at language. Like, you've heard of ChatGPT, so somehow they know something about the English language or Spanish language or some other language. But, you know, computers think well in terms of numbers. So how do you capture something about the meaning of language or the meaning of a word like cat as Cartesian coordinates? This is a question to ask. But I also mentioned something about science. So maybe you have a string of molecules, and maybe they're interacting in your body in some way, and maybe you want to do some experiments for drug discovery or to cure diseases, but you need a computer for that. So how do you represent a string of molecules as a list of numbers in a meaningful way that tells you something about that molecule? But while we're thinking about molecules, let's think of atoms, or things smaller than atoms, like subatomic particles, which comprise everything in the universe. So if you want to understand something about the universe and use a computer to investigate that, you have to think, how do I represent the state of a quantum particle as a string of numbers that's meaningful, that tells me something, you know, about the world that I'm living in? So I'm going to actually revisit each of these examples later on. But I just want to kind of give you this conceptual foundation for this conversation. When we're thinking about the sciences and trying to understand the world around us and using computers for that, computers speak in a very nice language. That is the language of mathematics, the language of numbers. And this is something that people are interested in. How do you find this? Okay, so just remember that. That's the punchline for that segment. Put this in your back pocket because it's going to resurface. So do you remember what the game plan was? The game plan was, I want to share some ideas that have happened in AI and the sciences, and I want to think about them in the past, the present, and the future, and think about God's sovereignty as we reflect on these things. So we're going to start with the past. So think way back, like 60 seconds ago, when I said, these things are called Cartesian coordinates. Remember, I said the list of numbers? Okay. Have you heard the word Cartesian before? You have? Oh, from where? Math class. Oh, okay. So do you know where that came from? Like, what does this adjective mean? Okay, I don't know if you've thought about this word Cartesian. Okay, this comes from the French philosopher René Descartes, who you will also know as the one who said, I think, therefore I am. Okay. So Descartes was not just a philosopher, but he was also a mathematician who did foundational work in algebra and geometry, which is why you hear the word Cartesian in math class. Now, there is this age-old question about minds versus machines, and can machines really think, or are they just manipulating symbols or sort of doing some mechanistic processes according to some rules? So Descartes had some ideas about this relating to things like automata and little preliminary versions of AI that existed in the 1600s. So Descartes had an idea. I don't know if you're interested in his idea, but you can imagine if he said, I think, therefore I am, then machines don't have brains, so they don't think, so therefore they are not in the sense that humans are. So his answer to this question was, no. Machines are little automata. They're not really thinking. They don't have minds, so they're different. Okay, you may or may not know that there are other mathematicians who are also philosophers, who also lived at the same time, who also thought about this question. So another person, his name is Blaise Pascal. Pascal did foundational work in probability theory, which you may have taken a class on probability theory as well, so you have him to thank for some things that you learned. Now, Pascal had a dad who worked in taxes and did taxes for their town. And Pascal one day noticed his dad is doing a lot of tedious, menial work, and he decided to invent a mechanical calculator to help expedite some of these things that his dad is doing. Okay, I'm going to tell you the relevance for that in a second. I'm not sure that Pascal explicitly wrote about his philosophical ideas relating to this question, But if you look at some of his theological musings, you can see that he really viewed humans as distinct and unique things. So he's probably of the mindset that even though we can automate things like math computations, human thought can't really be automated. So that's kind of his contribution to this question. Are machines really thinking, or are they just kind of manipulating stuff like a calculator? Well, interestingly enough, there's another mathematician around the same time who's also a philosopher who was aware of Pascal's calculator. His name is Gottfried Leibniz, who did foundational work in calculus. So you have him to thank for all the stuff you learned in calculus. And Leibniz had this interesting idea, which you can't see because it's behind the podium, but he's thinking, okay, Pascal just made this calculator that's automating certain tasks. Leibniz ended up inventing his own calculator, too, that could kind of do some similar things. And so he got to thinking, relating to this question, can machines really think, or are they just sort of manipulating symbols and procedures? Well, Leibniz thought, what if actually our thoughts are just symbols? What if there's some universal language of these abstract symbols, and human thought can be reduced to strings of these symbols that can kind of be manipulated according to some rules, so that if you had a philosophical disagreement with someone, you just sit at the table and you crank out these symbols according to some rules, and there's your answer. So this is what Leibniz is thinking. Okay, I don't know what your thoughts are, maybe I do, but I'm just sharing this with you, this history, in case it's interesting to you. Now, I want to fast forward 200 years to the 1900s. There is another famous mathematician, maybe not so much known as a philosopher, but as a computer scientist. His name is Alan Turing. So if you've ever gone online and you do the CAPTCHA tests, you know the CAPTCHA tests, like click on the number of fire hydrants to make sure you're not a robot. So the T in CAPTCHA stands for Turing, okay? So Alan Turing is a mathematician and computer scientist, and he's well known for many things, particularly his work during World War II. So Turing worked with a group of mathematicians and cryptanalysts to break codes that the Germans were using to attack military ships in the British Channel, right? There's this machine called the Enigma machine. Maybe you've seen the movie, The Imitation Game. This is about Alan Turing. Okay, so the field of computer science has a lot to thank Alan Turing for. So what are his thoughts regarding this question? Can machines really think, or are they just manipulating symbols? So the thing that's interesting is that Turing kind of does away with this philosophical stuff. He's like, forget that question. Let's ask a new question. What is intelligence? So I'm really giving you the Cliff Notes version, but essentially Turing's perspective is based on the fact that his team was able to crack codes that, with a computer that they invented, that humans alone were not able to crack. His thought is, what if intelligence is essentially just cracking codes? What if it's just the ability to solve puzzles? This is what intelligence is. So let's forget about whether things have minds or not, whether they're thinking or not. Can they crack a code? Can they solve a puzzle? Ever since then, this is sort of the perspective, I think, that's been inherited in the community. I think it's a low view of man, which stems from a low view of God, but here we are. Okay, why am I mentioning this? As I think about how these chain of events over history, how does this relate to God's sovereignty? So actually, Romans 2:4 comes to mind. So let me explain it this way, and then I'm going to read it. So I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but those mathematicians I just mentioned, they did foundational work in algebra, geometry, probability theory, calculus, and now ideas in logic and computer science. Those ideas are woven into God's creation. It's almost like an invisible part of God's creation, which is the foundation for the sciences. I don't know if you've thought about this before, but God did not have to make this world so intelligible. He did not have to give us this beautiful language of mathematics by which we can probe deeply into the wonders of his creation. It could have just been here, there's like people and there's a world that they live in, but He didn't have to give us access into the complexities and the beauty. And yet, in his sovereignty, he has. And I think it's amazing that he allows people over the centuries, whether they are Christians or not, whether they are doing science and mathematics for his glory or not, to still have deep access into the work that he's done. And I think of his patience and his kindness over the years, even when people are doing things for their own glory and not for his glory. And that's what makes me think of Romans 2:4, which encourages us not to think lightly of the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance. So I think of, Romans 1:20, God's glory is brilliantly on display. He makes himself accessible to us. And even when man does not acknowledge him, even though God gives them great access, he's so kind and he's so patient and he's just making himself available for folks to come and repent. Anyway, I think this is amazing. When you think about the past and the history, there's a lot that's going on there, and just God's glory is on display, even in his kindness. Okay, what about the present, though? What's going on in AI today? So perhaps when you think of artificial intelligence, the first thing that may come to mind are large language models, like ChatGPT. You've used ChatGPT before by show of hands? Yeah, so quite a few of you. If not, I want to let you know there's other things happening in AI besides just large language models, which I'll get to in a second. But let's say something about ChatGPT for a second. So this is a website you can go to, and you can type in a query, and you can ask it something, and then it generates text in response to your prompt that sounds very human-like. So I went to ChatGPT, and I said, what is a large language model? Please explain to me in simple terms, because I just wanted to see, can it explain what it is to itself, to me? And I like part of its answer, actually. It says, how do I work? Basically, imagine teaching a computer to read and understand language the way humans do by feeding it lots of examples. Now, basically, this is like a very sophisticated autocomplete. So when you're texting someone on your phone and then it says, oh, the next word you probably want is this, or like when you send an email, kind of fills in. So this is based on probability and statistics, and these are where examples come in. So essentially, you look at all the things that everyone has ever spoken, and you can get a sense for, if I say something like, I'm going to the grocery store to buy da-da-da-da-da, then with high probability, based on everything everyone has ever said with that sentence, the thing that comes next is probably like milk or bread. Not eggs, because we can't buy eggs now. But okay, so this is essentially how it works. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I want to revisit an idea. I want to try to connect the dots for you. So do you remember I said a helpful way to communicate with computers is to attach Cartesian coordinates to things? So this is key in how ChatGPT works. From a very high level, what ends up happening is you assign coordinates to all of your words like cat, but you start randomly. Again, how do you represent the word like cat by numbers? So you just start with something random. And then you have this training data, which is like everything on the internet, and a whole bunch of corpora of text. And there are mathematical operations that allow you to compare the coordinates of words one with another. And there's a way to sort of multiply them so that you get another number out that tells you something about how closely related one word is to another. So you do this a bunch of times, and then you kind of adjust your numbers based on how they're talking to each other. So that's what all of these wispy things are. These are the words that are talking to one another with these very sophisticated math operations. And then at the end, based on this context, you get an improved version of your coordinates for your word, and then you can use that contextual information to get probabilities. So, the probability of something involving cats may, include words that have other words like pets and furry and cute and things like that. This piece of technology and the algorithm behind ChatGPT is called an attention mechanism. Attention, because your words are attending to one another. So this is cool. This is something that came out in 2017, actually, this algorithm, but it wasn't until 2022 when ChatGPT was released to the wild, and we all know about it. Okay, so I just wanted to say something a little bit about large language models. What else is going on in AI? Well, I don't know how you use ChatGPT in your daily workflow, maybe to look up information or write emails or something, but you may or may not know that mathematicians have also used language models in their research. So I want to explain this to you. A couple years ago, there was a team of researchers at DeepMind, which is a company owned by Google, an AI company owned by Google. And they produced a paper, and here are some headlines. AI scientists make exciting discovery using chatbots to solve math problems. The tagline, breakthroughs suggest technology behind ChatGPT can generate information that goes beyond human knowledge. Wow. The next headline, Google DeepMind used a large language model to solve an unsolved math problem. So this is very cool, but I think the headlines are blowing it a little out of proportion. So I want to tell you what is the math problem that this AI solved, okay? Okay, good. It's called the CAP-set problem. The CAP-set problem. I'm going to tell you what the problem is, and then I'm going to tell you how their AI solved it, and then I'll let you be the judge if you like those headlines or not. Okay. Here are 9 dots. I'm going to ask you, don't tell me out loud, please circle a line. Find a line. Here's a line. Let's find another line. There's a line. Let's find another line. There's a line. Let's do it again. I claim this is also a line. This is a line if you imagine the grid wrapping around itself like the game of Pac-Man. You know Pac-Man, where you enter out on the right and come back on the left? So if I think of this as like Pac-Man game, then my line is a line. You see that? The thing on the top left is the thing I circled. Okay. So this is a line. Now, here's a question we can ask. Very simple question, very elementary question. What is the largest number of points on this grid, assuming it wraps around like Pac-Man, that we can select so that no 3 of them form a line? What's the largest number of points we can select so that no 3 of them form a line? This is what mathematicians call a cap set. It's capped off, I guess. Okay, think about the answer. Don't tell me, because I'm going to tell you. It is 4. Okay, you can see I circled these 4 points. No 3 of them form a line. Okay. Now, this is very simple, but I have to let you know. These dots are actually my sort of visual simplification of something a little more complicated. So each of these 9 dots actually corresponds to 2-dimensional coordinates. So I'm not going to write that down because it's getting too much into the weeds. But each of these dots is really a 2-dimensional coordinate that has some numbers, and the lines relate to the numbers. So why did I mention 2 dimensions? Because you know what we like to do. We like to think of higher dimensions. So if you ask this question in 2 dimensions, I just told you the answer is 4. Mathematicians have asked this question in 3 dimensions. If you ask this question in 3 dimensions, it turns out the answer is 9. If you ask this question in 4 dimensions, the answer is 20, turns out. And you can keep on going. Now, here's the important part. There is no formula for this. So it's not like the quadratic formula where you just plug and chug. There's nothing on your calculator. You cannot go to Google and just figure out this answer. So using very sophisticated ideas and branches of math called number theory and arithmetic geometry, people have definitively figured out that in 6 dimensions, the answer is 112. That's the size of a cap set, the largest cap set in 6 dimensions. We know that for sure. We know for sure in everything lower, 6 and lower. But when you get to 7 dimensions, we're not sure. So the largest cap set someone has found in 7 dimensions has size 236. Is that the largest? We don't know. Maybe there's something larger, someone just hasn't found it yet. In 8 dimensions, the largest cap set someone has found using these sophisticated mathematical ideas is of size 496. That is the largest someone has found until a couple years ago when this AI system found one larger of size 512. This is what the headlines are referring to, okay? Now, here's the thing. They did not go to ChatGPT and say, hey, ChatGPT, we've been working on this problem for a long time. Here's how it goes. Here's some examples. Here's what people have been doing. We got stuck here because we tried this. What do you think? That is not what happened. So what actually happened, they went to a large language model, and they basically asked it to brute force its way to the answer. So they asked a large language model, write a computer program in a language called Python. Write a computer program that outputs cap sets of large sizes. So in other words, you're basically saying, write a computer program that searches the grid in 8-dimensional space, and it selects a subset of points, and then it checks, is that a cap set? Are there lines of size 3? If yes, then that's not a good program. If no, that's not a good program. If yes, keep it. And then the computer program checks, is it large though? Does it have a lot of points or just a little bit of points? If a little bit of points, that's not a good code, throw it away. If large, keep it. So they asked a large language model, produce codes that find these sets that have this special property. Now you know the problem. ChatGPT, things like that, they hallucinate, right? So sometimes things didn't work. It was a bad program. It had some gibberish. So they tossed it out, and they kept the good ones. And then they fed the good ones back into the large language model. Hey, we like these. Do more like this. Do more like this. So they keep this iterative process until the large language model produced this code, which is from their paper. And when you run this code, it finds a collection of points of size 512 that happens to be a cap set. And they said, aha, 512 is bigger than 496. And they wrote a paper in Nature, very prestigious journal. And then, you get headlines like that. So I'm not diminishing their work. It's very cool. And in fact, there's a mathematician who was on this project. He's not at DeepMind. He's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Jordan Ellenberg. And he gave a talk at the Simon Center. Really great talk on this work, but I appreciated what he said. This AI, although impressive, did not give any new insights into the mathematics. So it doesn't know anything about the problem. It didn't uncover any new theory. It didn't give him really any new ideas that can help him come up with a better formula or better tools to address this problem. And then also, if you ask this thing to search in 9 dimensions, it fails. So it's very specific. It's very specific. All right, I just wanted to give you an example of how AI is being used in actual professional math research. I thought that was pretty cool. Let me give you another example of how AI is being used in the sciences. So I want to tell you now about something called the protein folding problem, for which the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded a few months ago in October. Okay, what's the protein folding problem? How does it relate to AI and the Nobel Prize? Okay, proteins are essential to life. Proteins are comprised of sequences of amino acids. Now, you have a sequence, a chain of amino acids, and it likes to fold and coil up on itself to give you a 3D structure like you see on that side. And it turns out the 3D structure of a protein determines its function in its environment, whether it's in your body or in nature or something. So the shape of the protein tells other molecules around it, oh, hey, this is what this thing does, based on that shape. That shape is uniquely determined by this sequence of amino acids, which I think is very cool. It's almost like an alphabet, and the alphabet says, what is the meaning of this protein? Okay, diseases happen, I'm not a biologist, but my understanding is diseases happen when proteins misfold, like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, when proteins misfold based on mutations in the amino acids. So if you can predict the 3D structure of a protein given its amino acid sequence, that's great because that gives you insight into the molecular level that can help you make synthetic proteins to do certain tasks, maybe for drugs or to cure diseases. So this is like a grand challenge that's been going on in biology for 50 years or something. How do you predict the structure of a protein given only its amino acid sequence? Okay, I just want you to appreciate how difficult this is. Now, let us all pretend that we are a protein consisting of 100 amino acids. I want you to appreciate how many options this has. Now, it turns out every molecule here, every one of these beads is a molecule which is comprised of atoms. And these things can interact with each other in a certain number of ways. And if you count all of the ways, turns out the number of possible configurations this thing could be in is 500 quadrillion, okay, which is a 5 with 47 zeros behind it, which, by way of comparison, there are only 75 with 17 zeros behind it, grains of sand on the earth. There are all of these possibilities that this chain of amino acids could be in, and yet the one you actually see in nature is just like 1 out of 5 times 10 to the 47. Okay, so again, let's appreciate how big this number is. So if I'm this protein, I'm going to just go down the list. Okay, is this the structure? Is this? No. Okay, is this the one? Is this the one? Is this the one? Is this the one? So let's just say we do that at a rate of 10 trillion configurations per second. So that's really fast. Let's just say we try it. That's 1 with 13 zeros behind it. How long is this going to take us? If we try 10 trillion configurations per second, that ends up being 300 quintillion tries per year. So that's a 3 with 20 zeros behind it. So how many years is this going to take us to exhaust the list of possible configurations that we could be in? 1 octillion years, which is a 1 with 27 zeros behind it. That's just one protein. And yet, in reality, this protein folds into its exact shape in less than a second. Okay. Now, it's a little bit like a slinky. So you know if you have a slinky and you pull it like this, it's very unstable, right? It wants to go to its happy place. So whatever this 3D shape is, 1 out of 500 quadrillion. So it's just, it's like very unstable as an unfolded chain, and it wants to get into its stable position as a folded chain. Okay, again, just to help you appreciate this, it's estimated, I guess historically, that it takes about 1 PhD year's worth, which is like 4 to 5 years, to understand one protein. So do you know how many proteins are known to science? 200 million. Okay? And this group from Google's DeepMind wrote an AI that can predict accurately the structures of all 200 million proteins. So they have saved 5 times 200 million, 1 billion PhDs year worth of time. Great, that's good for them. Okay, so they wrote a paper that came out in Nature in 21, and so they won the Nobel Prize for this in October of 24. And I have this picture. Does that picture look familiar to you? Yeah, this is the attention mechanism from words. From large language models. So again, they do not ask ChatGPT the answers. Okay, this is not their use of AI, but instead they take some of the architecture, the neural networks, some of the algorithms that were used in large language models, and you can imagine, right? A sequence of amino acids is like a sequence of letters. Your symbols are not from the English alphabet, they're from the amino acid alphabet. So you have these strings which look like sentences, and so you can kind of compare them to one another and sort of see how do they relate. They also incorporate physical information about the world around you because we are confined to 3D space, and so there's some limitations to how your molecules can interact. So they sort of take some of the ideas behind the algorithm for large language models and they adjust it for that. I think that's a very cool application of AI. How does all of this relate to God's sovereignty? Again, these are just my personal reflections. So one thing, I think we may be tempted to kind of at times esteem the creation more than the creator. So the technology is impressive, Human ingenuity is impressive, but all of this stuff pales in comparison to the majesty of our Lord, who is the creator above all of this. So I'm reminded of 1 Chronicles 29:11, which says, "Yours, O Yahweh, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. Indeed, everything that is in the heavens and the earth. Yours is the kingdom, O Yahweh, and you exalt yourself as head over all." So I think about language and the complexities behind it that linguists have been trying to study for years, but it's God who gave us language. And I think of these proteins. I mean, how do the proteins know to do this? It's because, Christ upholds all things by the word of his power. I mean, we can study this and give scientific names to it, but it's ultimately God's sovereignty that rules over all of these things. And even when I think about this CAPSET problem, what an elementary question. How many points can I circle so that there's no line in it? And yet, it's so difficult. And even that just humbles us and reminds us of how small we are and how great God is. All right, well, I have to move on for the sake of time. What about the future? Certainly, there are a lot of things I could say now, right? Like, what about world governments? What are people doing with AI? What's the latest? What's this DeepSeek thing out of China? Like, are humanoid robots going to take over the world? The answer is no, by the way. So there's a lot of things that I could say, but again, in the spirit of personal reflections, I'm just going to close by saying something really quick about quantum physics. Okay, so have you heard of quantum computers? Yeah, okay. So in case you haven't, let me just say, quantum computers are a type of hardware that are fundamentally different from your laptops and your iPhones and the computers you know now, okay, which are based on silicon chips. They process information on silicon chips. Quantum computers process information on individual atoms. Individual atoms, or things that are sort of mimicking atoms like superconducting qubits, if you've heard of that. How do they do that? That's another talk for another day. But people are thinking, okay, so quantum computers kind of exist, but companies like Microsoft and Google and a whole bunch of startups, they're working on them. It's a very tough engineering challenge because you have to isolate the atom, so that if you sneeze, you don't mess it up because they're very sensitive. So it's a hard problem. But if you had such a computer, you could ask, what does machine learning look like on this thing? Do you get advantages? Is it better than doing machine learning on a regular GPU or something? It's worth investigating. So to investigate this, you have to figure out, how do I encode information from the real world onto a collection of individual atoms? That ends up being like hitting them with lasers at a certain pulse and duration, so there's ways to do that. But if you want to think about this computationally, you're ultimately assigning a list of coordinate vectors to your atoms. So you have to figure out, what's the best way to do that? What's the best way to represent the state of this atom that's encoding information from the real world onto a computer so that I can do stuff with it? So we're back to this idea again. Now, there are several ways that people in this field do this, but it's relatively new. We're talking about the future anyway, and it's a sort of niche because everyone is thinking about AI now. So people are thinking about quantum, but it's not really in the news. So some collaborators and I from Deloitte and MIT, we were thinking about this problem, and we had some ideas on how modern mathematics can maybe help these engineers think a little bit better about this problem. I'm not really putting this slide up to give a plug for my own work, but I wanted to share this because maybe you haven't thought of this before. But for those Christians that God has called to do research in the sciences, there is something wonderful about trusting in his providence and in his sovereignty as he's called you to do research in this vocation in your life. And maybe there are different ways that he might see best to glorify himself in that work, whether it's being a witness for him in the workplace or sharing ideas in a venue like this. But maybe this is an idea that we don't get to talk about that often, which is just there's precious fellowship that comes with trusting in Christ in the middle of your research, even though you don't always know where it's going to lead. And even though you don't always know where the whole field of AI and technology is going, but when you seek to be faithful to the Lord, there's a lot of precious answers to prayer that are behind this. So I have stories that I could tell you that, I can't publish in an article, but I can tell brothers and sisters in Christ. Okay, so the last verse that comes to mind as I kind of wrap up thinking about all of these ideas and looking ahead is Hebrews 1:3, which talks about how our Lord Jesus Christ is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature. In it, he upholds all things by the word of his power, who having accomplished cleansing for sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So I think this is so nice. There's a few things I want to point out here. It's Jesus who has accomplished cleansing for sins. And that reminds me of what we said about Romans 2:4, where it's God's goodness that leads men to repentance, to receive cleansing of their sins from Christ. And it's Jesus who sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And as we remember from 1 Chronicles 29, that majesty belongs to Yahweh alone. And it's Jesus who upholds all things by the word of his power, all things including the subatomic particle forces that hold the particles together and the atoms and the mysteries behind the proteins, as well as sustaining the timeline in which all of these events take place. And that makes me think of this nice quote from F.F. Bruce in his commentary on the Hebrews. He upholds the universe, not like Atlas supporting a dead weight on his shoulders, but as one who carries all things forward on their appointed course. So the title of this talk was God's Perfect Timeline. We may not know where that timeline is heading and all of the things in it, but what a comfort to know that it's our sovereign God who carries all things in that timeline forward on their appointed course, which he's appointed for his glory. All right, many things I did not talk about, so I'm just going to leave you with some resources. If you're interested in connections of AI to humanity and society, John Lennox, who is a mathematician at Oxford, wrote a nice book relatively recently called 2084. If you're interested in myths like, are robots going to take over the world? The answer is no. My friend Monica Vroman introduced me to this amazing book called The Myth of Artificial Intelligence. Thank you, Monica. I highly recommend this. If you're interested in the latest news, I'm telling you, 24 hours is like so long in AI world. So much happens in a day. There's a very nice podcast I like called the AI Daily Brief, which gives you 5 or 10-minute updates about what happened that day. And if you're interested in AI and theology, please scan this QR code. This is an article written by our own Dr. Abner Chow recently in the Journal of the Math3ma Institute called Biblical Wisdom on Artificial Intelligence. He goes through, what does the Bible say about intelligence? And how does that compare to biblical wisdom? And where is all of this headed anyway? And so he gets into Revelation. And so you can access the PDF. It's free right there. That's a great read. I highly encourage you to read it. And with that, I think I'll end here. Thank you.